Today, I have a special guest with me, Matt Orsagh. He's the author of a newsletter called Degrowth Is the Answer. That is my answer to degrowth. We're going to go backwards so we can go forwards, or we're not going to go forwards. And Matt has a really great newsletter. I like his messages. Matt, thanks for being here. I want to know about degrowth being the answer, how you got there, and what made you start it.
Thanks for having me. First of all, I'm happy to be here. I started, how far back do I want to go? I started writing the newsletter in September of 2023, but I'll go back and give you a little bit of my tale of woe and how I got here. I'd like to joke with people that one useless undergraduate degree in college wasn't enough for me, so I got two. I got an English degree and a film degree because I'm a storyteller. I love stories. And those are the things that I gravitated to. Then a couple of years out of school, I realized I should probably go back and get a business degree to be more useful, more marketable, just be able to do more in the world. And so I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, moved down to Atlanta when I was about 13, 14, went to school up in Indiana at Notre Dame, and then back to Atlanta. I was in Atlanta and I got my graduate degree in finance at Georgia State. So I'm in my mid to late 20s by now. I had a friend from high school who had moved to New York and needed a roommate. I thought, hey, I've got a finance degree and I know someone in New York. I'll go to New York. It was a little naive, but it worked out just fine. Then I got my CFA charter, which is a Chartered Financial Analyst designation. Those are people around the world who are financial professionals. It's just a certification for financial professionals because I did that in college or in my graduate degree. And I thought this is the next step and I can do that. I joined this after I passed my CFA. You have to take 3 exams. I don't recommend it unless you're really into finance. But if you are, then it's not a bad career path. Then I actually joined the CFA Institute, which is this global financial professional training association. But they had just started up a think tank arm of the organization. So I was fighting the good fight for corporate governance and sustainability issues for quite a while. I joined them in 2005 and just left them a couple of years ago. I started out focusing on corporate governance issues at companies, and I gravitated to that because it was the stories of what's going on at companies. I knew all the numbers and could build the spreadsheets and all that finance stuff, but I like the stories. What's the story of this company? What's the story of this industry? What's the story of whatever's going on in the financial world? That led into what people have probably heard about. ESG was started in 2005 by the PRI Principles of Responsible Investment. It came out, the meetings to put it together were in 2005. It came out in 2006. And ever since then, more and more investors and businesses have been concentrating on ESG issues, environmental issues like climate, social issues, anything that's a human resource issue at companies, but also modern slavery and those heavier issues. And then governance, just how the company is governed. Over time, that grew from focusing mostly on governance when things started to the E and the S getting more prominence, especially the E and things like climate change, natural capital, biodiversity loss. I hope this story isn't too long, but it frames how I got here. And that led me to coming across degrowth a couple of years ago. What degrowth is, de-emphasizing growth in our society, in our civilization, because we're slaves to GDP and growing our economies. Politicians get elected doing that. CEOs get promoted doing that. You and I have mortgages to pay and kids to send to school and families to feed. The way to do that in our capitalist economy is to grow that pie so we all have a little bit more and everybody's happy. That works as long as you have a planet that has inexhaustible resources. Unfortunately, that's not the case with us. We're running into some of the barriers of that right now. And the environmental implications of living that way are coming back to haunt us. Climate change is just the most prominent one in people's minds. But I would tell people to look at the Planetary Boundaries Framework. And it's something that was started by this place called the Stockholm Resilience Center, I think about 10, 15 years ago. What they look at is 9 planetary boundaries that we don't want to breach, because if we do, it causes problems for us that are feedbacks that really harm our ability to survive and strive on this planet. We've already crossed 6 of those. Climate's just one of them. Land use and water use, plastics in our environment, and a couple others.
Are those the same as the tipping points?
No, tipping points are different, but they're related. Like climate leads to tipping points. Jet stream is something different. The Gulf Stream and the Atlantic possibly shutting down comes from climate change and the melt of glaciers and ice on Greenland that makes the fresh water come into the ocean, and eventually that can shut down the Gulf Stream that warms Europe. I think would be, I forget the exact numbers, but it would be quite a bit colder without the Gulf Stream bringing that warm water up.
15 degrees minimum to 75 or something ridiculous.
I forgot what it was, but thank you for that. So you could have a mini ice age in Europe in the not too distant future, when people think, oh, it'll take care of climate change. But we've based our societies and how we live in Europe on what we have now, and so that would be devastating if that happened. There's many other tipping points like that. It's the Amazon rainforest going from a net carbon sink to a net carbon emitter if it gets cut back too much, and we're on track for that, although it is slowing down now because they're starting to take care of it. But so those are tipping points. But the planetary boundaries, I think, is a good framework for kind of jumping into this issue. What degrowth says is, let's focus less on trying to grow our economy because it leads to these problems. And people might say, wait, I have to grow. We have to grow for me to have my job, for me to get paid, for us to live. And that's just the case because that's the society we built. That's the civilization we have. That's capitalism as it is. Now, it's not going to be easy to change that, and it's not going to change overnight. But the things we can do, we can live differently and within our means as a society, as a civilization. And it's things like shorter work week because we don't need to work as much as we do. It's just interesting stories on this. One of the reasons that the 5-day work week came around in the United States was Henry Ford back when he was changing the world with the automobile industry. We used to have a 6-day work week here in America, and he found that it was more efficient if he gave his workers a little bit more time off. There were less mistakes, higher quality in the vehicles and all that stuff. And so that was one of the main things that eventually moved us to a 5-day work week.
He also found it was better if he paid them so they could buy cars.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And Henry Ford was no great humanitarian. He did it because it was a business decision.
Yeah.
John Maynard Keynes famously, I think it was the 40s, when he said by the turn of the century, this is year 2000, that we would have a work week of about 15 to 20 hours by the time the year 2000 rolled around because we'd gain some more inefficiency and we wouldn't need to work as much. He's not far off in what we could do. We could have a shorter work week. We have efficiency gains with all these wonderful tools we have. And AI there are problems with AI, of course, but that will only allow us to be more efficient. Think about the work you were doing 20 years ago, 25 years ago, and doing that same work today. Does it take the same amount of time? No. So if we cut back to a 32-hour work week, what time that would give us? We'd travel less. We'd use less resources because you're going to work one less day a week. You'd have more time with your family. If you have teenagers, maybe that's not such a good thing. But for most people,
I love my teenager.
Well, I'm not there. I'm going to have teenagers in a couple of years. Okay. Taking the degrowth path is the idea is to move to a well-being-based economy, one that's not based on trying to grow GDP. If we grew GDP about 2% a year, we'd have doubled our economy, I think, by mid-century. Think of the resources problems we're having now. The idea of degrowth is to move to a well-being economy and base our decisions on what's our collective well-being.
We have a degrowth plan too for our group. Our group has to work 20 hours a week because we're so sensitive that we require it for our bodies.
Yeah.
Also mental illness on the flip side. Choice exceptional people either break one way or both ways. So 20 hours a week is actually the ideal for us, but also we're creative. So we create things. Our body is meant to make things as well. And that was another thing that was really easy for us with degrowth, is that since we've always been makers, I make a lot of the things. I've rebuilt cars. I've made my own furniture. I've made my own jewelry. We like to make. Degrowth idea for our group was pretty easy.
We're just animals, after all. Yeah. Think about the animals you're around in your life. Are they doing the same thing for 8 hours straight? Or do they do something and take a little nap, take a break, go get something to eat, take a little break, go get something to drink, take a little break, go play with their friends, take a little break, go explore something, take a little break. That's how we're meant to live. That's how we do it. Most of us can't concentrate on a task for more than an hour or so at a time. And then we have to take a break and do something else, refresh our minds, and then come back to it or do something else. There's diminishing returns if we're just trying to crank out 40-hour, 60-hour weeks with almost anyone. The shorter time frame makes sense. So the less work is just one part of it, but it's also things like universal basic income and other issues like that. There was a town in Canada in the mid 70s, I believe, that they did a social experiment on. I think they gave a couple $100 to folks who were at the lower end of the income scale to see what outcomes that would lead to. And what it led to was better health outcomes, less stress, medical outcomes. Kids stayed in school longer because they didn't have to leave to help their families to earn a living. Less crime. All outcomes were generally better. What it was is there wasn't that fear attached to not being able to pay rent, not being able to pay the mortgage, not being able to buy food, and less need to hustle to take that low-paying job just because you had to put some food on the table. Stockton, California did something similar. I think it was in the late 80s, early 90s. And what they found was if you have that for people that needed a universal basic income, it helps all outcomes for that society. Mm-hmm. We did this experiment with COVID. A lot of people got checks from the government for a couple months, or for what I forget, was it a year, 15 months, 18 months. What the stat that jumps out to me was child poverty in the United States went down. It was like 8, and again, I don't remember the exact numbers, but it was like 18, it went down from 18, 19% to 7%.
It's also, the child poverty numbers are already ridiculously low. So it was like 40% to 20% because if you just did low basic income, that was huge. So it's even bigger than people realize.
Yeah, I was like, can we keep doing that? That's a great, look at the outcomes it had. But politically it wasn't, so it went away. And I would tell people to explore, what I've written and others have written. Job guarantees is another one. Universal basic services is another one, such as public transport and all those kind of, and healthcare and education and those kind of things. Look at the Nordics in Europe, who have a kind of a more fulsome social contract than we do here in the States.
Yeah, they also have half-day schools, which is really good for the lot of us who struggle to sit like for that period of time. Then the other part is that it opens up a whole nother avenue for income for the creatives, because the kids come home, they just have those 4 basic classes, and then they do what they're interested in. So it's almost ideal because you're getting like the main points that society wants everyone to know. But then you come home and then there's a strong middle class because they have the creatives working, cultivating kids one-on-one for their creative things.
I didn't know about that half-day thing. That's great.
It's not all of them, but the ones that are particularly interested, ironically, in the profoundly gifted. Mm-hmm. So you're learning by doing and making, and then you can apply that to chemistry, physics, math, and know it so much more completely. Whereas our society only gives you a 2D version of that. It's harder for you to make and grow.
That's interesting. That's great. Yeah. A good way to think of it is to address the planetary boundaries that we've crossed: climate, land use, water issues, plastics, and biodiversity loss, nitrogen and phosphorus in our rivers and oceans that result in dead zones in those places. I think those are the 6. I may have missed one. But to give nature a chance to heal and get back in balance, we need to, of course, we hear all about greening the supply of energy, and that's great. Wind, solar, geothermal, green our energy sources as much as possible, although that has its own issues as well, because you have to mine those. If you replace every internal combustion engine with an EV, that switches the problem from CO2 to all the mining you have to do for all these minerals. Mm-hmm. Degrowth says that, yes, green everything, but also cut back on the number of cars you have. Pull that, for the economics people out there, green that supply curve, but pull that demand curve down. Consume less, consume better. Structure our cities so they're walkable, bikeable. I was doing research on this recently. In the United States, we have about 330 million people, 340 million people, and we have about 300 million cars. Now think about all the children who can't drive. We have more cars than actual people who can drive, which is insane.
Extra cars just laying around.
Yeah, extra cars just laying around.
Yeah.
Yeah, you got to have a lot of rental cars for just in case someone needs one, I guess. But why not target? This could be the future. It could be that with self-driving technology, you could have a fleet of mostly electric autonomous vehicles that are only 150 million of them.
Why
And
do you go to
don't.
self-driving vehicles? Why not trains or rail?
No, no. Yes, trains and bikes and stuff in the cities. But if you're living in Iowa City and you've got to get somewhere less populated,
Mhm.
you're still going to have cars, but you'd have a lot less of them.
Mhm.
You wouldn't own one. This is in theory. You wouldn't own one, but you just dial one up, say, I need to go to the grocery store. Let me get a car. One will come and get you in 10 minutes. You'll go do your shopping or go see a movie or go visit your friends or whatever.
Mhm.
We don't need 300 million cars. That's just one. Scale down consumption and resource use as much as you can, as well as greening, getting everything. People complain that, everybody's going to go live in caves and we're going to have a huge recession. Before oil was discovered, I don't think we were living in caves.
But how many caves are there? There's a lot of people.
There's too many people for all the caves.
Yeah.
That's just the hyperbole people throw out there.
Mhm.
Back at the Conference of the Parties meeting last year, on the big climate change meeting that happens in November, December every year, I think the head from the UAE, the head of the group that was running it, complained that if people get rid of oil and gas, let's go back to living in caves. And it's just hyperbolic scaremongering. But the degrowth being economy we want to get to is one where you have more time to spend with your teenagers. You have less stress about keeping up with the Joneses and paying your mortgage. You'll still have a mortgage and you'll still have responsibilities and bills. But if you have universal basic income for people who need it, if you have a shorter work week, if you have a society that's based more on, and I think needs to bring it all together and people would like more, is you have a better sense of community because you're more involved in your community because you have time to. You can belong to that community garden, or we have a huge population of baby boomers who are retiring. I see this as an opportunity to switch to this model. Those people are going to need more care from their communities. Some of them aren't going to have family to help them. That's one thing that we can do more to build community. But I think community and solidarity are things that are going to could help if we go this route for us to transition to that way of life. And it's not going to happen next Tuesday. But I think if we're having this conversation 10 years down the road, I would hope we're well on the way to that kind of model and then moving forward towards it as we go along.
What our aging demographics look like in about 10 years. One of the concerns that I see when I look at that is our aging demographic. A lot of the boomers have not been very kind to the youngest demographic. We have a very divisiveness. Our government and the people who have a lot of power really like to separate us.
The othering of someone
Mm-hmm.
is a great way to breed mistrust and contempt in a group. When that goes back to our instincts when we first were living in caves, someone who's different, it's better to not trust them than to trust them.
I actually think that's very much put into our system in school. I don't know if that was true for maybe from a different tribe or whatever.
Yeah.
They recognize differences in people in your group for sure, because everybody had a gift or a thing to offer. The othering we do, making everybody the same right out of the gate and then being like, you're gifted, you're not, you have grades. I wonder, how do you see people moving through that? The universal income, it would be great for the creatives.
I don't have an answer how we get there, but sorry, everybody. Mm-hmm. I don't have an easy answer. I wish I did. I think it is community that can get us there. Things were better in the past when everyone knew each other. And let's go back to that time. It's just that when you know someone and you talk to them and you get to know their story, it's harder to other them. It's harder to believe some kind of conspiracy theory about that group. Or if you hear a powerful faction trying to get you to divide and conquer those groups. So, and if we follow business as usual and don't really do much, we're in for environmental catastrophes.
We're into cliff dwelling. The irony of that statement that we're all going to live in caves, literally that is why those guys lived in the cliffs, because of environmental collapse.
Yeah. So we're going to have environmental collapse, it'll be harder to get food. It'll be harder to get water. People won't live as long. There'll be parts of the earth where, people can't live. It'll create huge displaced populations in the tens of millions every year that are looking for a place to go. Mm-hmm. And that's all. So let's not do that. If we go down this degrowth path, if we go down a path that's more based on well-being and less on economic growth, we can mitigate some of those things. There's always going to be problems. I'm not going to say otherwise. But if we focus more on a well-being economy and get to where we're living within our means environmentally, and we pull back to the safe side of those borders of the planetary boundaries, you have more time and resources to have that community and build that community. The very rich in the world won't be as rich, but most people will be better off and happier and healthier, better educated. That's not a bad world. I'm not going to say that's easy to do. We have political problems. We have political factions. We have an economy and a way of life that's ingrained in all of us and most of us. And saying, hey, let's change that is hard. And I see it when I talk to people about this. And I come from the financial world. And a lot of people in the financial world, anywhere really, but in that world, and I'll talk about it because I know it, is their reaction is, wait, you're telling me I'm going to have less stuff and less money? No, I don't want that. I want more money and more stuff. You explain that's bad in the long run. And studies show that over a certain level of income, you're not really getting any more happiness or fulfillment in life. You're just getting more money. I like wealth. Everybody likes wealth. But I understand that to pursue it to the point of degradation of my future and my children's future is folly. I hope the work that I'm doing helps more people realize that and helps our society go towards that place. And I think we will get there. It's just a matter of the speed with which we get there. Will it happen soon enough? If you look at surveys of people on their views of capitalism, and I'm not bashing on capitalism. It's just the system we live in. We used to live in feudalism. A lot of bad things about feudalism. And we live in mostly a capitalist society. A lot of bad things about capitalism. 200 years from now, it'll be some other ism, and there'll be really bad things about it that need to be fixed. That's just the nature of it. But if you look at,
isn't the nature of it? Like, you could live with a cashless society. It would be fine. We could live with a financial system that is closer to what the Amish would work, and they would be totally fine with that. 200
years from now, we may be. Who knows? But just what I'm saying is now, like, you look at surveys, young folks, anyone under 35 or 30, usually they don't have a positive view of the economic system we have. Whereas 10 years ago they did, 20 years ago they really did, and 30 years ago there was no doubt that capitalism was the way, the truth, and the light. Where the trend is going with the people who are now about to enter, those people who are in their 20s and 30s and 40s, they drive the economy with their consumption. That's how it works. They don't like the system more often than not. Less than half of them do.
They can't drive the economy right now. They don't have the money to buy houses. They can't afford to have children. There's not going to be any drivers there.
But I think that's where they are seeing how the system we had is broken and needs to be changed. And they will change it once they get power. They don't have power now. But look at the average age of our leaders in Congress. I think the average age in the Senate is over 70. It's right around high 60s or low 70s, and the age in the House isn't much better. I think it's low 60s. So those folks aren't going to be in power a lot longer if the laws of nature stay intact, and they will. We're going to get to the place where these policies are going to come. It's just, do we get there in time? And this way of thinking about the world is going to come. And it's just, do we get there in time?
The average age of the U.S. Senate, 65.3, up from 64.8.
I actually thought it was higher. I thought it was higher.
Yeah. And the oldest senator is 90. Chuck Grassley.
A young, spry 90.
Yeah. My mother-in-law and grandmother are around that age, and they're in homes.
Yeah. The joke is, why would you want someone that old running the country when at home you don't let them have the remote?
Yeah. Or you were afraid to have them driving.
Not that there isn't wisdom in those people.
But it's levels of dementia start to kick in because their body's breaking down.
Yeah. It's time for the next generation to take the reins. If you look back to how most indigenous societies ran and were, the kind of cult of individualism that we have here in the United States just wasn't a thing. It was the group that mattered the most. And if you compromise that group with your selfish, self-centered actions, you were ostracized, or that behavior.
Hunting trip you never returned from.
Yeah, you were taken out on a lot of hunting trips. And there's a balance. I love the American individualism and exceptionalism to a point, because I love the parts of my life and the parts I see in my kids that are their personalities and their individual things. And I celebrate them, but not to the point where it hurts society or civilization. We've lost track of that, I think, and not just in the United States, but it's just very pronounced here.
So the individualism of the United States is a funny thing, though, because we've stripped it away by taking away everybody being their creative self. We individualize by buying things. We individualize by external, simple, stupid things. I find that the version of individualism we have is already just indigenous societies. Everyone's creative. That's the whole thing.
Yeah.
But you're creating what you need. You're creating and learning and growing as a whole practice for everything. So the individualism we have has been turned on its head in the worst way. And the collective societies, there's so much you can read about the Asian, particularly Japan or China, or those, they have social capitalism ratings for people. Those collective things go a little too far too. So I would just like health.
Like I said, there's a balance to be struck there. And I like the way you put it about we're sold consumerism as individualism. Yeah. And there's great, this could be another to our podcast, but just on advertising and how that grew. And it grew out of psychoanalysis and people, I think it was Freud's nephew. It was one of the guys who started marketing. They recognized that you could make people confuse their wants and their needs, believe that their wants were their needs, and make them insecure. And that's what a lot of what advertising is, making you insecure about what you have. And this face cream is going to make you younger. This car is going to make you more virile. This whatever product is going to make you better. It's advertising. And that's part of the degrowth model is scaling back advertising. I like a lot of countries actually have, you can't advertise to children. You should push that a little farther perhaps, because there's so much that drives this consumerism that we just don't need.
When you started this thing up, like what made you feel so drawn to this?
I saw that, like, and again, I go back to, I see myself as a storyteller, and stories is the way we understand the world. We're very strange animals in that we tell stories, and we define ourselves by the stories we have. No other animal does that or can do that. But it's such an interesting part of what we are as people. And that story, or those ideas, that meme, whatever you want to call it, wasn't really out there for a lot of people. I came across this degrowth idea and the things behind it 4 or 5 years ago. And I remember thinking, how did I not come across this in my whole life? I wish I'd known this 20 years before, and I could have done more about it, known more about it, that there's a different way you could structure your society and live your life. It ends up being better for everyone. I wasn't seeing that discussion out there very much. So I thought that, and I discovered Substack about 2 years ago, and I put 2 and 2 together. I fancy myself a storyteller and a writer, and this thing isn't being talked about. These stories aren't being told. I can do that. I can help educate people and spread the word about this. Hopefully that helps and gets more people to understand it and helps us move to that way of life sooner rather than later, before it's too late. I wish I'd known about it sooner, and I wish we had been having these conversations sooner. I think we are the stories we tell ourselves as a society, as a civilization. And I hope 5-10 years from now, we're telling ourselves a story of a degrowth story or a well-being economy story, and focusing more on ourselves and our health and our education and our environment than we are on growth.
So just a couple of years ago, when you say that there's the whole onboarding or awareness of kind of collapse that most people are coming to, I remember them talking about this back when I was a kid. The Limits to Growth book came out in 1972. That's before I was born. I remember this in the 1980s, a big, huge push for the recycling and all of this earth stuff. And in the 1990s, it disappeared. Yeah. And I think around 2003, I think I became aware of, that's what that was. But it took a long time for everybody to know about it. How did it come to your attention?
I think it was during COVID. It wasn't really caused by COVID. It's just the job I had. I do a lot of research and reading around sustainability issues. And I came across degrowth just in my research. I remember there was like some sitcom in the 80s and 90s. I think it was Family Ties. Do you remember that one?
Oh, yeah.
The youngest daughter was upset about climate change. And I don't know, I was 20 or something. That's the first I'd heard about what that meant. I was like, oh yeah, that is a problem. And then it went away and I didn't really think about it. I knew what it was and I knew, oh yeah, eventually we need to do something about this. But it wasn't really in people's consciousness. It wasn't in my consciousness. The COP meetings didn't start until I think the mid-90s. I know scientists knew about CO2 in the atmosphere and what it did. The scientists at ExxonMobil, it was just Exxon back then, knew about it long before that.
We did have the ozone thinning, and that was a thing for like sun, but I don't remember too much other.
But the ozone was solved.
Yeah.
The ozone, we got rid of the CFCs and the ozone was solved. It's interesting to read just the missteps in history. If the leadership of the oil companies had done something different. I think it was the first Bush administration in the early 90s. George Bush Sr. wanted to do something about climate change, and then he gave it off to someone, I forget who it was in his cabinet, Sununu, and he quashed it, and nothing came of it. And the disinformation campaign that the oil companies have had over the past 30 years. And think about the 90s, the Berlin Wall had just come down. America had won the Cold War. Everything was hunky-dory. I'm probably dating myself with saying hunky-dory. Everything was good. Things were growing and everybody was happy and the pie was growing and people were generally getting better off all around the world. China was starting to grow. And so how do you stop the music at the party? Of course, there were people that were worried about it and talking about it and raising their voices about it. I look back at the degrowth literature and there isn't really anything until the early aughts, and then it slowly grows. And now there's a lot more coming out there. And hopefully people will hear this and have these conversations and read what I've written and go down those rabbit holes and learn about it, and it will take off. But I came across it through my research and then started researching more and reaching out to people and talking to them. I had a podcast when I was at CF Institute, and this guy, Timothée Paric, he's a French guy. He teaches at Lund University in Sweden, I think. He's very well known in the degrowth circles, and he was kind enough to be on the podcast. I used that platform to help educate people. I knew that this was a really important thing when I did that podcast for a year and a half. And I saw that episode was the most listened to one of any of the episodes by a pretty wide margin. And it was targeted to financial professionals, the folks that have the money and have the power in the financial industry. And this wasn't tens of millions of people listening to it, but the interest was the most for that. I had all kinds of topics that I talked about. I talked about climate change. I talked about oceans. I talked about financial reporting around capital and climate. I talked about all different kinds of things. But the thing that the people gravitated towards the most was degrowth. I was like, wow, there's something here that if I talk about this and research about this and write about this, it's not just going to be screaming into the void. People really want to know more about this, which is where it started for me, that I got the idea of doing more around degrowth.
Interesting. When you look at it, like, how do you see it going? What are your hopes, but what are also your realistic views?
My realistic views are, it's a range. It could be a lot of things. Step back and look at the history of Earth. We're in the middle of our 6th great extinction on Earth. And the time we're living in now, or up until now, was really the Goldilocks, zone of Earth. There's so many things, environmentally catastrophic things that happen all the time on Earth, going back to, when life first appeared on Earth. And the volcano under Yellowstone National Park is the biggest volcano on Earth, and it erupts like every 600,000 years. And it hasn't erupted for 800,000 years or something, like we're due.
Yeah, we're also due for the giant earthquake on the east or west coast that should just take everything from 5 over and drop it into the ocean.
Yeah. Oceans rise and fall from ice ages and climate change. And we've had this climate change in the past in Earth's history, but it's usually happened over millions of years. It's man-made because of what we're doing. That broad scope this happens. We're messing with things to the point where it's going to get really bad for us. We're not going to go extinct, I don't think. But I can see population of Earth. We crossed 8 billion last year. I think it'll be much less than that by the end of the century. Mm-hmm. Birth rates are under 1% or under 2% The replacement
Like
rate
1.8 or something.
is
Yeah.
what 1.7, 1.6 to 1.8, and it's different in different countries. Japan is right around 1 or something like that, or just over 1.
Yeah.
A lot of that they surmise is environmental and endocrine disruptors and plastics in our environment. I saw a study recently where I think it was a hospital in New Mexico looked at like 60 to 80 placentas in mothers after birth, and all of them had plastic. Come on.
I know. Can you get any place that doesn't, basically? Like, no.
So we're screwing things up a lot to the point where nature is going to say there's going to be less of you because of that. And I see that happening, and I accept there's going to be some form of natural population control from Mother Nature. It has the potential to be brutal, really bad, yes. But we can mitigate that if we live consciously and try to move to a more well-being economy. We're not going to stop everything, but we could make our lives better and the lives of most people in the world better versus if we do nothing. So we have to do something. We're not going to avoid some of the stuff that's already happening. Sea levels will rise. It will get hotter. Our water will be less easy to come by. We will have less food security, all those things. We will to some extent. It's just the extent. That's where I tell people, like, it's your children's future that we're playing with.
And your grandchildren's.
And your grandchildren's, and your children aren't going to be able to have grandchildren if we go too far in one direction. And so that's the story I start with. But I try to say it in a nice way. You got to meet people where they live. You got to meet people where they are. And there's audiences I can have a very frank, brutal conversation with, and audiences that I have to ease them into it. I think if you're ever wagging your finger at someone, you lose them. And there's some people you have this conversation with, they're just going to ignore you, and climate change isn't real, and don't worry about it. That's just going to, you're not going to convert those people, or they're not going to listen to you. But whoever you're talking to or trying to convince or just trying to educate, I think you have to meet them where they are, where they live. And that's going to be different for an 18-year-old college kid versus a CEO of a Fortune 500 company. You can get to both of them, but it's just a different story you tell.
So do you see anything that's fascinating around the actual change of the population or such like that? One of the things that I thought was fascinating was Chernobyl, wolves are now cancer resistant. I wondered, as part of your degrowth, do you see anything around humans changing?
I don't know. That's interesting. I hadn't really thought of that. I'm sure that will happen in some cases, in some ways. If we live in a world that is whatever it settles on, 2 degrees in Celsius anyway. If we live in a world 30, 40 years from now that's 2 degrees warmer or 3 degrees warmer, what does that mean? Do we adapt? Do we just leave those places that you can't live? I grew up in the Midwest in the United States, and you've seen that Rust Belt when all the manufacturing left. People left, went to the South. Not everybody, of course, but a lot of people did. You could have another migration the other way, because I think the Great Lakes have 20% of the fresh water in the world, right? And a cooler climate. So Duluth, Minnesota looks mighty attractive compared to Pensacola, Florida, 30 years from now. Yeah. And 100 years from now, Florida is going to have a lot less electoral votes 100 years from now. They'll probably have 0 because it'll be gone.
It'll be underwater. Yeah.
If we don't do anything.
Yeah.
There'll be Jacksonville and Tallahassee may still be around, but most of it will be gone. The Gulf of Mexico will extend up to near Memphis because it will take back the Mississippi River, or that part of it. There'll be an inland ocean in the middle of Australia for the same reason, if we continue and not doing enough.
Yeah, it will be amazing change. I think the most interesting thing will be how much we have connection with each other and how much we can still communicate. Because if we maintain that, there'll be coordinated efforts. If we don't, it will be much different. All those Starlinks, they might actually end up cutting one group completely off and allowing one group to have so much knowledge compared to the rest. And we'll have to figure out something. We could have incredible differences between the rich and the poor, or the powerful and the not powerful.
This is one of the things I wrote on, the idea of all these billionaires, and you don't have to be a billionaire to build a bunker, but building bunkers and survival shelters. My thinking is, who's going to work for you in those bunkers. How are you going to get your food? Do you want to live underground for 20 years in a row without ever going outside? Did you want that?
You'd be very pale. I'll give you that. You're gonna need some vitamin D source.
You're not winning anything if that's
No.
if that's where it ends up. Maybe invest those billions into building a better society instead of your bunker.
I really appreciate you coming by and talking with me. It was fascinating to just see your different perspective and how you got there. Everybody who's on this space comes from different avenues, and it's interesting to see how they each got there. I just want to say thank you. Is there anything you want to add that I can make sure the audience hears?
I would just say, read about these ideas, talk to people about these ideas. As I said, I think community is our way out, or our way not out, because bad things are going to happen no matter what we do. But I think connecting through things like this and more people talking and understanding these issues and understanding what's really going on is the best course of action. So I'm happy if someone wants to reach out to me and argue with me or tell me I'm wrong, that's fine. Or read what I've written or ask for some other resources to continue on their journey of educating themselves about these things. I'm happy to do that. You can, and as we said earlier, we were starting this conversation, I'm the only Matt Orsagh in the world. Yeah. Orsagh's a strange name. There may be another one, but I've never come across them. So I'm easy to find. I can't hide from you. If you want to reach out to me on social media, I'd be happy to do that.
I know you're on Substack. Are you on other platforms?
Yeah, mostly LinkedIn and Substack are the ones I use the most, but I'm on Twitter and X now, Facebook and Instagram and Threads are ones I look at occasionally, but LinkedIn and Substack are the main ones I'm on.
Thank you, Matt Orsagh, who does Population Degrowth Is the Answer. That's his newsletter on Substack. I highly recommend everybody go out and look at it. It's a great newsletter. He's got a very important message, and we do need to really seriously talk about how we're going to do degrowth. This is part of my platform as well. Degrowth is the answer, but it could be a beautiful answer. It could be an answer that leads to community. It could be an answer that leads to a slower pace of life, a more healthy, complete, family-oriented, artisan sort of life. And so degrowth is the answer for many things, if you ask me. I hope, Matt, thank you so much for coming on, and I hope you enjoyed their time.
I did. Thank you for having me. It was a great discussion.